The 5 darkest secrets ancient civilizations tried to erase. The Assyrians made pyramids out of severed heads. The Carthaginians had a market for babies to burn alive. And the Romans? They turned lunch breaks into public torture shows. Your history teacher lied to you. Ancient civilizations weren't noble. They were unhinged. Today, we're exposing 5 secrets so dark that archaeologists debated for decades whether to even publish them. Let's dig in. Secret 1. Let's start with something that'll make you grateful for modern medicine. Ancient Assyrian psychological warfare. Now, you've probably heard the Assyrians were brutal. But brutal doesn't quite capture the industrial-scale nightmare factory they were running between 900 and 600 BC. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer cities. They turned terror into an art form. We're talking about detailed reliefs carved into palace walls, showing exactly what they did to conquered people. Impalement, mass beheadings, flaying people alive and displaying their skins on city walls like twisted interior decoration. And they documented it, proudly, with measurements. King Ashurnasirpal II literally had scribes record his greatest hits. I cut off their heads and formed them into pillars. I flayed the nobles and covered the walls with their skins. This wasn't propaganda. This was a resume. He was bragging about his atrocity count like it was a high score. But here's the darkest part. It worked. Cities would surrender just hearing the Assyrian army was coming. Parents would tell their kids horror stories about Assyrian punishments to make them behave. The Assyrians pioneered the concept of fear as a weapon, and they were so effective at it that when their empire finally fell, neighboring civilizations literally burned their cities to the ground and salted the earth to make sure they stayed gone. The secret they tried to bury. Archaeological evidence suggests they also practiced mass deportations, forcibly relocating entire populations, breaking up families, destroying cultures. Millions displaced, entire ethnic groups erased. And for centuries, historians downplayed this as ancient conquest. Nope. This was systematic cultural genocide with a PR campaign. Secret 2. But if you think state-sponsored terror is dark, wait until you hear what the Carthaginians were allegedly doing in the name of religion. Because nothing says pleasing the gods quite like, well, you're about to find out. Child sacrifice in ancient Carthage. Yeah, we're going there. For decades, historians debated whether this actually happened, or if it was just Roman propaganda to justify destroying Carthage. Spoiler alert, the archaeology isn't looking good for Carthage's defense team. They found these places called top hets, ritual burial grounds containing the cremated remains of thousands of infants and young children. And before you say, maybe they just had high infant mortality, these weren't normal burials. These were deliberate ritualistic cremations, often with inscriptions thanking the gods Baal Haman and Tanit for hearing their prayers. Ancient sources describe how wealthy Carthaginian families would sacrifice their firstborn sons during times of crisis, famine, war, economic collapse. The ritual involved placing the child in the arms of a bronze statue of Baal that had been heated until it was red hot. Drums would play loudly to drown out the screams, because apparently, if you can't hear the horror, it doesn't count. Now, here's where it gets even darker. Some evidence suggests that poor families would sell their children to wealthy families who needed a sacrifice but didn't want to give up their own kids. Yes, you read that right. There was potentially a market for sacrificial children. Nothing says advanced civilization quite like outsourcing your religious obligations to the economically desperate. The Carthaginians tried desperately to hide this practice from Greek and Roman observers, conducting rituals in secret, restricted areas. When they realized they were losing the Punic Wars, they allegedly destroyed records and defaced inscriptions. But you can't hide thousands of tiny cremated remains. Modern scholars still debate the extent of this practice because acknowledging it means admitting one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations, pioneers in navigation, commerce, and democracy, also had a Dark Age horror show running in their temple district. Secret 3. Speaking of civilizations with pristine reputations, built on uncomfortable foundations, let's talk about everyone's favorite ancient democracy, Athens. Because turns out, those enlightened philosophers had some thoughts about population control. Ancient Athens and the practice of infanticide and exposure. Yeah, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and theater also had a fun little tradition of leaving unwanted babies on mountainsides to die. We sanitize this by calling it exposure, but let's call it what it was: state-sanctioned child abandonment. Here's how casually horrific this was. If an Athenian father didn't want a newborn, maybe it was a girl, maybe it looked sickly, maybe he just couldn't afford it, he had the legal right to leave it outside to die of exposure or be eaten by animals. This wasn't some rare emergency measure. This was normal, socially acceptable. Aristotle literally wrote about it in Politics, like it was municipal planning. The secret? This practice was so common that it created an entire economy. Childless families would adopt exposed infants, but not out of kindness. Many of these children were raised as slaves. Some girls were taken specifically to be trained as prostitutes. There are ancient texts discussing the profitability of rescuing exposed infants for later exploitation. The really dark part? Athenian law was super specific about inheritance and citizenship, so exposing babies, especially girls, was seen as a rational economic decision. Can't afford to divide your estate among too many sons? Leave the extras on a hill. Got a daughter who'd need a dowry? Mountain time. Ancient Athens basically practiced eugenics with an economic justification. And the philosophers? Plato suggested state-controlled breeding programs. Aristotle advocated for limits on family size, with exposure as the enforcement mechanism. These are the guys we quote about ethics and morality. Let that sink in. Athens tried to bury this by not officially recording exposure rates, not keeping statistics, not discussing it in public forums. For centuries, classical scholars downplayed it as not that common or exaggerated by critics. Then archaeologists started finding mass infant burial sites outside ancient Greek cities. Turns out, when you dig deep enough, secrets come with receipts. Secret 4. Now, if you're thinking, at least the Egyptians were chill, oh buddy, do I have news for you? Because those magnificent pyramids, they came with a side of practices that would make a horror director say, too much. Ancient Egypt and retainer sacrifice, specifically during the First Dynasty. We all know about mummies and golden tombs, but let's talk about what happened when an early Egyptian pharaoh died. Because apparently, one body in a tomb was considered inefficient. During Egypt's First Dynasty, around 3000 BC, when a pharaoh died, they didn't go to the afterlife alone. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of servants, wives, guards, and officials were killed and buried alongside them. Not because they volunteered for eternal service, because they were murdered to serve in the afterlife. Archaeologists have found subsidiary tombs surrounding royal burial chambers packed with bodies. Young people, mostly. Buried in small, cramped spaces with no grave goods, no honor, no ceremony. Just systematic execution to populate a dead king's afterlife court. Some show signs of poisoning, the merciful method. Others show trauma suggesting more violent deaths. But here's the truly chilling part. Some of these people were buried alive, sealed in tomb chambers while still breathing, left to die of suffocation or dehydration in the dark. We know this because some skeletal remains show panic positions, hands clawing at walls, bodies contorted in final desperate movements. They knew what was happening, and they couldn't stop it. Later, dynasties mostly phased out this practice, replacing human sacrifices with ushabti figurines, little statues that would magically serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. But early Egyptian rulers conveniently destroyed records of the retainer sacrifice period. Most temple inscriptions and king lists start after this practice ended. Coincidence? Absolutely not. Modern Egyptology spent decades soft-pedaling this discovery because it complicated the narrative of Egypt as an enlightened ancient civilization. Can't sell museum tickets with, yeah, they had spectacular art, but also mass human sacrifice. The evidence is undeniable now, but it took archaeologists years to even publish findings because institutions were worried about damaging Egypt's historical reputation. And you want to know the darkest secret within this secret? Some evidence suggests the practice never fully stopped. Even in later dynasties, there are suspicious deaths among royal servants coinciding with pharaoh burials, just quietly, unofficially, with plausible deniability. Secret 5. And finally, because we've covered empires, city-states, and kingdoms, let's end with the civilization everyone thinks they know everything about: Rome. Specifically, let's talk about what happened at those famous gladiator games that Hollywood really doesn't want to show you. The Roman Colosseum and the damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild animals. You've seen the movies. Gladiators fighting lions, dramatic music, Russell Crowe yelling about honor. Cool. Now let me tell you what was happening during the lunch break. Between gladiator matches, Romans needed entertainment while they ate. So they'd bring out condemned prisoners, criminals, war captives, Christians, slaves who displeased their masters, tie them to stakes or cross them on devices, and release starved animals to tear them apart. This wasn't combat. This was public execution dressed as entertainment, and the crowd loved it. But it gets darker. Romans would get creative with these executions. They'd reenact mythological deaths. Someone condemned would be forced to play Icarus and get thrown from a height. Another would play Hercules and be burned alive. They turned human suffering into theatrical performances, and people would bring their kids to watch. The damnatio ad bestias wasn't just punishment, it was spectacle production. Animal handlers would starve bears, lions, and leopards for days before shows to ensure maximum violence. They'd sometimes sew prisoners into animal skins so the beasts would attack more ferociously, thinking they were fighting prey animals. Every detail was engineered for maximum horror. Here's the secret Romans tried to bury. This practice was so common, so normalized, that it nearly drove several animal species to extinction in North Africa. Lions, bears, elephants, hippos, all hunted to local extinction to feed Roman blood sport. Thousands of animals killed yearly across the empire's amphitheaters. We have supply records. This was industrial-scale ecological destruction for entertainment. And the really uncomfortable truth? Christian sources recorded these events in detail because martyrs died this way. But Roman historians, they barely mentioned it, considered it too mundane to record. That's how normalized state-sponsored torture murder was in ancient Rome. It was too boring to write about. So, there you have it. 5 ancient secrets that prove our ancestors weren't the enlightened philosophers and noble warriors your textbook made them out to be. From child sacrifice to human spectacle executions, turns out ancient civilizations were just as capable of nightmare fuel as any modern horror story. If this video shattered your romanticized view of the ancient world, Smash that like button and subscribe to Destin Forge, because we're just getting started digging up the uncomfortable truths ancient history tried to bury. Drop a comment telling me which secret horrified you most, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue proving that the past was absolutely unhinged.